Well, very much obviously the war in Ukraine still continues. Um, and of course, as we are at the time I'm still doing this, as Mariupol is still standing, as far as we know, it's still not fully under control of Russian forces. There are still resistance by the Ukrainian army still in Mariupol. Um, how long that continues for, I can't really tell you. Um, by the time this video comes out, it may have fallen. It may take a few more days. Who knows how long it will last eventually? But that's not what we want to talk about today. There has been a lot of talk of the unrest being in Vladimir Putin's circles, that they are not happy with how the war in Ukraine has been progressing. We've seen the switch from Russia themselves saying that they are going to change tack and just focus on the liberation of the Donbass region. And to say that they've, quote, changing operations, that this is just a change in the other way of the war now is completely wrong, because what they attempted to do was essentially a smash and grab raid. They thought that they could just roll into Ukraine, that the Ukrainians would welcome them with open arms, especially in these areas that, when you look at them politically, had always very much heavily voted for pro-Russian parties. We'll see how that changes. Certainly in eastern Ukraine, potentially the next time an election happens in the country, which will be very interesting, because again, if you're Vladimir Putin and you wanted to, shall we say, bring Ukraine into your sphere of orbit, the last thing you should really have done was essentially go to war with Ukraine and heavily bomb the eastern part of Ukraine, which was always very historically pro-Russia. So that is the last thing Vladimir Putin should have done. But of course, again, we're not talking about that today, but there has been lots of theories floating around about how Putin essentially might get couped, or there might be a coup. But of course, you've got to the other question that's not being asked. In fact, this is one of the few articles out that I have seen that is talking about this, of what happens next. Like, if Putin gets couped, what are the potential outcomes of this? Because it is in no way certain that the war in Ukraine comes to an end, as we'll get into in a bit in this article. So, like I say, as always, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can, well, buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much for watching. And for all the people who do support the channel that way, thank you very much. So let's go into this article, because we're just going to ignore all this, because it basically sums up what we've said about all this, about the fact that, talking about there being a potential coup. There's a lot of, backpedaling. Of course, Biden's recent comments about, regime changing, and then they're backpedaling about it. But what we really came for here was to talk about this. So let's assume for a moment that Putin does fall. What happens next? So, oh yes, by the way, before we do that, this comes from The Guardian with the title of "What Fantasies of a Coup in Russia Ignore." So anyway, let's go on to this. So let's assume for a moment that Vladimir Putin does fall. What happens next? So one possibility: a new authoritarian leader replaces him, winds down the war in Ukraine in order to save Russia's economy from disaster, and eventually seeks to try and repair the rupture with the West. Yet, any successor to Putin who emerges from Russia's current political order is more likely to share his animus towards NATO and the West more generally, as well as his attitude toward Ukraine. He is almost certainly to be a man, may continue the war, using different tactics for fear of defeat, could very well imperil his position before he has even more time to solidify it. So that is one possibility. Just because Putin gets couped and removed doesn't necessarily mean, as was said there, that the war comes to an end. Indeed, it's very likely someone else could, who would, again, probably come from Putin's party. Maybe it's again someone else in his inner circle. Could very well be someone like Lavrov. Maybe, we don't know. But to say that they would end the war, or maybe even change tactics, or maybe even potentially escalate this war to try and end it as quickly as possible, just go full blown, Grozny in this case, just start, just destroying the cities, just systematically, just artillery striking them till they're nothing but rubble, and then just, well, sending in the troops to retake the car park, as one Russian commander put it. So this is the second outcome, which again could be just as likely. We don't know. All these may be wrong. We don't know. When you have a coup situation like this, it's very, very difficult to predict where on earth sometimes these could go. So a second outcome might be that the Russians, weary of war and enraged by the economic pain created by Western sanctions, do rise up and overthrow their government, eventually clearing a path to democracy. But a rebellion could fail. So those who hope for this result must ask themselves if it is responsible to engage and encourage a mass revolt where there is no position to protect the protesters from the massive repressive military machine at Putin's disposal. And that is right. If there is a rising, a rebellion against Putin, we could see some very, very bad scenes coming from the protesters. Like I say, we've already seen Putin's overwhelmingly willingness to just go out and, arrest people. You don't even have to hold up a sign saying "Stop the war." You just have to hold up a blank piece of paper, and you'll be, shall we say, spirited away, arrested, and then prosecuted very, very quickly. So we really have to ask that question: is it really responsible for us to push the Russian people towards a revolution? As much as some of the West might want to see that could be very, very bloody for the Russian people to actually have to do and fight to essentially secure their freedom. And that's not guaranteed, because there was a piece on Vice I saw very recently of a Ukrainian literally, having to look after her grandfather, having to ferry him up and down, to up and down from the house down into the cellar in the bomb shelter they've created. And she's on the phone to her aunt, who's again in Russia, and she's parroting all the stuff that Russia is saying, that the Russian soldiers would never do that. That must be those Ukrainian Nazis that Putin's always talking about, which just goes to show you how much a lot of the Russian people are still in the grip of Putin's propaganda machine. So the likelihood of a revolution could happen, but ultimately it would probably fail because of Putin's very, very powerful military machine that he has, and could repress them very, very brutally. So the next third scenario that he puts forward. So there is a third possible scenario. Unrest in Russia surges into a very prolonged chaos, even a civil war, pitting those who have a huge stake in the survival of the existing political order against their opponents who want to consign it to history's rubbish heap. This could produce political turmoil, bloodletting, and a disarray into the world's only other nuclear superpower, one that extends from Europe to the Pacific Ocean and has nearly twice that of the United States and land borders with at least 14 other countries. So obviously you're talking about, well, what happens to all these potential nuclear weapons in all this? This is again something worrying, and the political, again, revolution, who knows what could happen here. It's really an extension of what we were talking about with the second scenario. We don't know really what could happen. If Putin gets, couped, the paths of what could happen are myriad. And I know the guy who wrote this article and put these forward, these three ideas. I think if you were to talk to him, he'd probably say those are just three of what he thinks would probably be the likeliest three scenarios. I think if you were to get him to say, well, actually, there's probably about 10 different scenarios that could likely happen. You've only got to look at revolutions that happened in the past. The famous one, obviously, being the French Revolution. No one ever predicted or knew that, obviously, it would end up, if you think about it, with Napoleon sort of taking power and claiming, the revolution is over. I have fulfilled the dreams and objectives of the revolution. Or maybe you go back a bit further and you see Max Robespierre, taking power and enacting the terror of all the bloodshed of the guillotine and the bloodshed that he created. Again, it's not exactly the idea of what the revolutionaries really wanted. But then you can go even further back to the people who were like, okay, what we want was still going to keep the king, but we want, shall we say, more powers on his authority. We want to make him a far more constitutional monarch, while giving sort of the general Estates Assembly more say in what happened. Keeping the poors out, so it's still the three estates, but we're just going to ignore the poor people at this time still. So again, you never can really tell what are going to be the ultimate consequences from a coup. If one should indeed happen, you never know the political direction it could take. So even though there are people out there at this moment really, chanting on wanting a coup to happen in Russia, you have to be careful about where this coup could go and where it could lead, because the chances are it's not going to be bloodless. Very, very likely it is not going to be bloodless, because very, very evidently the status quo, as he said there in Russia, is going to want to keep their economic power. And Putin has, the military machine and the army, the police that are willing to act in a very repressive manner to essentially keep that status quo in check. So that's unfortunately the where we see it, where we stand at this moment in time. But what will happen, who knows exactly. But of course, thank you very much for watching. Please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button on your way out. And of course, down below there are links to my Patreon page and a notification link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee if you'd like to support the channel that way. And of course, thank you very much for watching and tuning in, and we'll see you all next time.